December 1941 saw Pearl Harbor lying in ruins. Nevertheless, the arsenal of democracy retaliates, and within months, thousands of pilots will take to the skies in planes manufactured by automakers, crafted with a singular purpose: to avenge Pearl Harbor. Over half a century ago, an unsettled world erupted into flames. Years of depression and isolation had fostered the belief that America was insulated from distant global conflicts. Yet, as the war escalated, America was compelled into an unprecedented unity. This collective determination, focused on a singular objective, would later be dubbed the Arsenal of Democracy. Few examples embody the arsenal of democracy as vividly as the Avenger, a Navy bomber with pride in its name. Forged by the hands of men and women, including automakers, seamstresses, machinists, and housewives, the Avenger stands as a monument to a time when an entire nation dedicated itself to achieving a single goal. Desperately in need of the tools of war to support a generation thrust into battle on foreign shores, America turned to the arsenal of democracy. The Avenger earned its name as the billows of black smoke still rose from the devastated Navy base at Pearl Harbor. Answering the call to avenge the Japanese attack, this torpedo bomber would fulfill its mission, as Japanese battleships and German U-boats soon discovered. From the Battle of Midway to the war's final day, the formidable Avenger not only served as a deadly Navy bomber, but also as a constant reminder of the achievements possible when America unites. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese Navy launched over 360 planes from 6 carriers positioned within striking distance of the US naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Unaware of the impending assault, American servicemen and civilians at Pearl Harbor were caught off guard. The base's Pacific Fleet units included more than 70 combat vessels and 24 auxiliaries, most of which were docked for the weekend. Among the 8 battleships in the harbour, 5 were sunk, 1 severely damaged, and the remaining 2 were hit. 2 destroyers were also sunk, while 140 aircraft were destroyed, with another 80 damaged. Fortunately for the Navy, its 3 carriers were absent from the harbour during the attack. Nevertheless, the loss of over 2,300 military personnel deeply affected the nation, hastening America's entry into the war. "Remember Pearl Harbor" would echo as the battle cry of the Navy's Pacific Fleet for the ensuing 4 years. Exactly 3 months before the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the inaugural flight of a new Navy torpedo bomber prototype took to the skies. This aircraft represented Grumman's submission for a design competition aimed at replacing the outdated torpedo bombers of the 1930s. Despite winning the contract, Grumman faced a significant challenge. Its factories were already stretched thin due to mass production of fighters. As production of the new torpedo bomber commenced, it became evident that Grumman would need assistance to meet demand. The day after Pearl Harbor, the US government mandated a halt to all automobile production. Almost instantly, assembly lines ground to a halt, leaving thousands of auto workers without employment overnight. Representatives from General Motors hastily pursued government contracts in a bid to sustain their plants. Their efforts to secure minor contracts, such as producing wheels for bombers or wings for the P-47, yielded unexpected results. Consequently, the auto giant found itself in need of establishing a new division, with GM veteran Cliff Goad appointed as general manager. Thomas Goad, his son, vividly recalls the whirlwind of events that ensued.
They thought they had a potential to get the P-47 wing, and that was when they happened to walk into the War Department. I remember someone from Linden, this investigation team that was trying to find a contract, and just at the right time that the government decided that Grumman had this neat new torpedo bomber, the Avenger, they're starting to build, and it was going to be the backbone of the Navy carrier-based bomber.
Driven by the urgency for contracts, General Motors embraced the challenge of aircraft manufacturing, birthing the Eastern Aircraft Division of General Motors. Transitioning from car production to aircraft manufacturing proved to be a monumental task. The looming threat from the East instilled a fear that permeated all levels of American society. The prevailing perception of the Japanese Empire depicted it as an unstoppable military force bent on dominating the Pacific and beyond. Anticipating a potential invasion, Americans were bombarded with newsreels depicting the ever-expanding Japanese war machine in theaters nationwide. For the American worker, this looming threat served as a compelling impetus to embark on this formidable undertaking. Under immense pressure, General Motors allocated 5 plants stretching from Tarrytown, New York to Baltimore, Maryland to the cause. The initial hurdle was reconfiguring these plants for aircraft production.
Of course, number one, you got to clean the plants out completely. Just move every piece of equipment out of them. You don't want to just scrap it, because everything you can save, you want to put in a warehouse so you can, when the war is over, you know you're going to go back to building cars again. So you want to be able to save all the equipment so that you can set up again just as quickly after the war.
At the Linden, New Jersey plant alone, over 5 miles of conveyor equipment had to be dismantled. Meanwhile, at the Trenton plant, an airfield was constructed to facilitate testing of planes fresh off the assembly line. However, accommodating the Avenger posed a considerable challenge, as it was the largest carrier-based plane of its era. Consequently, several plants required expansion simply to accommodate its size.
In the case of the Linden, they had to have one section of the plant that they had to raise the roof. And so when they had the assembled airplane, that they could take it down through that bay with a tail sticking up in the air to be able to clear the overhead rafters.
As GM officials scratched their heads over sprawling sheets of airplane blueprints supplied by Grumman, they realized that their greatest challenge would be finding people that could build an airplane.
They had to go and recruit from all over General Motors, engineers and people with skills in airplanes, because the aircraft companies they couldn't afford to let any of their people go. The government said you couldn't. You had to build these airplanes with your own people, and you can learn as much as you can from the aircraft companies. Go visit them and see what they do, but you can't have any of the people, because they need those people to build the planes they're already building.
A monumental endeavour was underway as men and women from across the nation united to manufacture the tools of war. With the conflict raging, time was scarce, and there was an abundance of work to be completed. On June 4, 1942, the Japanese Navy launched its most extensive offensive since the Pearl Harbor attack, targeting the US-held island of Midway. Unlike Pearl Harbor, US forces were aware of the impending assault. However, Japanese planes were en route to the island before the Americans could strike the enemy carriers. The Japanese assault on Midway Island was relentless and overwhelming. For the United States, the Battle of Midway was a pivotal moment. Failure to halt the Japanese advance would allow them to establish a base within striking distance of Hawaii, strengthening their hold on the Pacific. Just days before the Japanese offensive, 6 Grumman Avengers were dispatched to Midway Island, marking their debut in frontline action. These 6 planes were among the first Avengers to engage in combat. Over 2 tense days, inexperienced Navy pilots, having completed a condensed training course, awaited their call to duty. The remainder of the torpedo bombers tasked with confronting the Japanese fleet were the outdated Douglas Devastators already aboard the USS Hornet. For these torpedo bombers, the Battle of Midway resulted in significant losses. By late morning on June 4th, deck handlers aboard the USS Hornet anxiously awaited the return of 15 Douglas Devastators that had departed earlier to engage the enemy fleet. However, the crew aboard the Hornet would never witness the return of their planes. All 15 Devastators were downed by Japanese Zeros, with only one pilot surviving. Similarly, of the 6 Avengers that departed Midway that morning, 5 were also shot down. In a single day, Torpedo 8 suffered the loss of 20 planes and 44 men. Despite the devastating toll on Torpedo 8 at Midway, it's crucial to recognize that their sacrifices were not in vain. The true hero of the Battle of Midway was the Navy dive bomber, the Douglas SBD, affectionately known as the Dauntless on carrier decks. While it's accurate to attribute the sinking of Japanese carriers to these dive bombers, to suggest they could have achieved this without the presence of torpedo bombers overlooks key facts, a point often missed by some historians. During the Battle of Midway, torpedo bombers were the first to engage. Upon arrival, Japanese Zeros swarmed the low-flying American planes, while anti-aircraft gunners targeted the advancing torpedo bombers. With all eyes fixed on the action near the surface of the ocean, the dive bombers swarmed down from above, taking the Japanese ships by storm. It was a classic high-low attack, culminating in the destruction of 4 Japanese carriers. By the evening of June the 4th, victory had been secured at Midway, a pivotal moment in the Pacific theatre of war. Meanwhile, at General Motors, a very different battle was unfolding, the struggle to initiate aircraft assembly lines. Automotive employees were grappling with the unfamiliar task of building airplanes. With much of the workforce either deployed to war or allocated to other plants, GM turned to a vital resource that would become the backbone of their workforce during the war: women. Even prior to the war, women had demonstrated their proficiency as skilled seamstresses, having long dominated the labour force in garment and textile industries. Transitioning to airplane production proved to be a smooth shift for seamstresses.
Isn't this a funny place for you?
Now it helps win the war.
But after clerking in a fashionable store,
I like it here, and it saves my clothes.
yes, I suppose it would.
Did you ever try pleasing a bunch of women shoppers all day?
No, I never did.
Well, here I just have to please the boss, and he's a man.
And the work isn't too hard for you?
No, I used to work in a butcher's shop. I like this better. It's more excitement.
Isn't this pretty hot for you, Miss Spillane?
Well, I hear it gets kind of hot around the kitchen stove, too.
I never thought of that.
Yes, and it gets pretty hot out there in the South Pacific.
Given that airplane wings and tail sections primarily consisted of fabric, women were heavily involved in the subassembly of these components. However, in World War II, women's roles extended far beyond sewing, giving rise to the iconic figure of Rosie the Riveter. While the existence of a singular real-life Rosie remains uncertain, her symbolization embodies the invaluable contributions made by women during the war effort. She's really more of a mythical figure, a symbol of the American woman during World War II, a woman who put down the knitting needles and picked up a rivet gun. Rosie, the woman who exchanged her bonnet for a welding mask, transcended racial and socio-economic boundaries. She tirelessly worked long hours with a singular purpose: to contribute to the production of superior aircraft, knowing that they will be flown by her loved ones, her sons and brothers. Under the vigilant supervision of the Navy, she engaged in drilling, sanding, riveting and welding, standing shoulder to shoulder with her male colleagues. Despite the unwavering dedication of Eastern aircraft employees, instructing automakers in aircraft construction proved to be a challenging endeavour. To facilitate this process, Grumman provided General Motors with 2 PK ships. Grumman engineers constructed an Avenger using Parker Callon fasteners instead of rivets. The aircraft was then transported to General Motors, where the PK fasteners could be replaced. These PK ships served as invaluable references for the automakers, and by the autumn of 1942, the Avenger assembly at GM plants was well underway. On November 11, 1942, an eager crowd anxiously awaited the maiden flight of the GM-built Avenger. This flight held immense significance, not only because it would demonstrate the aircraft's functionality, but also because it would validate the automaker's achievement of building a flying machine. This aircraft was designated as the TBM, where TB denoted torpedo bomber and M signified General Motors. Notably, the Avengers deployed at the Battle of Midway bore the designation TBF, with F indicating Grumman's involvement. Beyond the Navy designation, both the Grumman TBF and the General Motors TBM were identical aircraft. This standardization was mandated by the Navy to ensure interchangeability of parts between the two variants. The bomb bay doors, shown here in the open position, house the torpedo, affectionately known by Avenger pilots as the Fish. The Avenger was a formidable aircraft, characterized by its large size and powered by a massive 1700 horsepower Wright engine necessary for carrier takeoffs. Robust landing gear designed to endure rigorous landings was a hallmark feature of all Navy planes. This was particularly crucial for the Avenger, renowned as the largest carrier-based aircraft of World War II. Crewed by 3 members, the Avenger played a vital role in naval operations throughout the war, earning a distinguished reputation for its versatility and reliability. One sat in an electrically controlled ball gun turret towards the back of the fuselage. The pilot sat in the front of the large greenhouse-style canopy, while the bombardier, who released the torpedo bombs, depth charges and mines, sat in the rear at the back of the bomb bay doors. By the war's end, nearly 10,000 Avengers had been manufactured, ferrying almost 30,000 aviators into the perilous theatres of war. Among these aviators was a young high school student named George Bush. Opting to forego a college opportunity, Bush enlisted with the Navy on his 18th birthday with aspirations of piloting the Avenger.
I chose torpedo bombers. I wasn't. Some of it was that I didn't think I was a particularly accomplished fighter jockey, one of these guys doing all these maneuvers. Secondly, the plane had great appeal to me. It was a team effort. There were 3 of us in the airplane. It was a stable aircraft. It was the largest carrier aircraft. So I asked to be trained for torpedo bombers, and I never regretted it. It was risky, of course, but that just went with the territory in those days.
Upon earning his wings in the summer of 1943, Bush commenced training in his newly acquired Avenger, which he affectionately named Barbara after his girlfriend back home. The dashing Bush was assigned to Torpedo Squadron 51, serving aboard the light carrier USS San Jacinto. One aspect that deeply impressed Bush about his new role was the importance of teamwork.
You had a crew, you had a team. I don't know whether you can see this, but in the back of behind the pilot, there was a turret, and you had a turret gunner in there, and then in the bottom of the airplane, you had what they called a stinger gunner or tail gunner, and they helped keep the plane up. We'd wash our own airplane. Our crews, we had a crew captain on the deck, on the carrier. But it just came together. You got to know them well. You shared experiences with them. And I've always liked team sports, team effort, even in the White House. And so I think that team concept had an appeal to me when I decided to try for torpedo bombers as opposed to fighters.
Like all naval aviators, Bush had to acclimatize to life on ship, which could be fraught with peril.
I guess my first recollection of the Pacific was these enormous high seas. And this was a converted cruiser hull, fast carrier. She ran with the big CVs. And it was hairy. One of our guys subsequently turned absolutely green. I mean, you've heard of people get seasick and turn green. This guy was green. The seas were rough. We couldn't fly in that kind of weather. But again, it was just part of our maturing as a squadron.
Just days after George Bush's enlistment, the United States launched a full-scale offensive against the island of Guadalcanal. In September 1942, the initial contingent of Avengers began arriving at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, forming part of an air group tasked with targeting Japanese shipping in the region. Despite being in service for only 3 months, Avengers had already acquired a rather unfavourable nickname. Marine Corps General George Dooley provides insight into this matter.
It was called a turkey. And why was it called a turkey? Well, because it sort of looked like a turkey. It sort of lumbered through the air, and in comparison to the F-6F Hellcat, which it closely resembled, it was not nearly as attractive.
During World War II, there was a pressing urgency to deploy Avenger pilots and their crews to the South Pacific. General George Dooley had a mere month to familiarise himself with his Avenger and his crew.
Seeing an enemy aircraft coming, batted at 12 o'clock. Well, actually, it was a bat at 6 o'clock. Pilots were all looking at 12 o'clock, and suddenly we realized that he had gotten twisted around, but he made up for it by shooting down the aircraft.
For American torpedo bombers, Japanese Zeros constituted only half the challenge.
But if you're going in against an enemy that's shooting at you with everything it has, the one thing you're going to do is want to get a hit.
As the Battle of Guadalcanal unfolded, Navy aircraft began delivering significant blows to the Japanese fleet, despite the formidable challenges faced by Avenger crews. In a mere 2-day period in November 1942, the Japanese lost 2 battleships, 3 destroyers, 1 cruiser, and 11 cargo vessels. General Dooley flew against the mighty Japanese battleship Kenugasa.
We're getting to the torpedo release point. Some gunner on the bow of the ship, the Kenugasa, zeroed in on me, and I had little red golf balls rolling all around my left side of my aircraft. I finally had to settle down getting to the torpedo release point. At this point, the gunners started hitting me in the port wing, and all you could hear was that as these shells were hitting home. We released, and I went home, and on the way home, I nursed the aircraft very carefully, not knowing whether or not the wing was going to stay on. As it turned out, when we got home, the wing was very sturdy. It could have taken any number of Gs and still held up.
The errors observed at the Battle of Midway were not repeated at Guadalcanal. Torpedo bombers now assaulted ships with the full protection of Wildcat and Hellcat fighters providing cover overhead. By early 1943, American naval fighters had honed tactics for effectively engaging their skilled adversaries. While accumulated combat experience bolstered American prospects in the high-stakes aerial battles over the South Pacific, the introduction of a new fighter, the F-6F Hellcat, decisively tipped the scales in favor of American aviators. Since 1941, the Grumman Corporation had been prioritizing the production of their new fighter, the F-6F Hellcat, renowned for its superior durability compared to its predecessor, the Wildcat. The government urgently required Hellcats, prompting rapid production. With the intensification of the war effort, Rosie transitioned from riveter to pilot. The Women's Air Service Patrol, WASP, a group of highly skilled female pilots, played a pivotal role in ferrying Hellcats to the West Coast to meet the Navy's urgent demands. Though never formally endorsed by the Army Air Corps, the WASP stands as a proud chapter in Grumman's enduring legacy. By the summer of 1943, the Grumman Aircraft Company was dedicated almost exclusively to production of the coveted Hellcat. By this juncture, the US Navy wasn't the sole purchaser of Avengers. Britain expressed interest as well. The Women's Air Service Patrol diligently expedited the planes to Navy units on the West Coast and to the Royal Navy under Lend-Lease provisions. By January 1944, Grumman ceased all Avenger production, redirecting focus entirely on the Hellcat. The Navy and General Motors were so assured of their capabilities that all Avenger production was entrusted to them. In December of 1943, the 1,000th Avenger had rolled off the assembly line at the GM plant in Trenton, New Jersey. The subsequent 1,000 would be manufactured in less than a third of the time. Eastern Aircraft's general manager, Cliff Goad, had earned such respect among industry leaders like Larry Bell, Donald Douglas, and Glenn Martin that he was appointed chairman of the Aircraft War Production Council. Cliff Goad's son, Tom, also developed a newfound appreciation for aviation.
We lived and breathed airplanes then. I've made models of the Wildcat and the Avenger, and I dreamed of being a Navy flyer someday. And it was very inspiring, you know.
Allied triumphs at Guadalcanal and in New Guinea had unmistakably put the Japanese on the defensive in the Pacific theatre. US naval forces initiated an island-hopping campaign aimed at securing communication and supply routes from Australia, while establishing air bases to facilitate deeper strikes into Japanese-held territories. As the island-hopping strategy unfolded, Avenger squadrons found themselves deployed in the crucial role of close air support for Marines landing on the beach. Each Avenger could carry 4 500-pound bombs, delivering a formidable blow against entrenched Japanese troops on the beachhead. Following days of intensive bombardment to soften Japanese defences, the 7th Infantry Division and the 4th Marine Division executed landings on the Kwajalein Atoll. By the conclusion of the first week of February, the major resistance on Kwajalein had been subdued, marking another significant stride in the Allies' island-hopping campaign. The Navy had planned to move further into the Marshall Islands in mid-April, but Japanese resistance had been so weak at Kwajalein that further Marine landings moved forward ahead of schedule. In the aftermath of days of relentless aerial bombardment from Navy Avengers, US Marines traversed through the devastated landscape in search of any remaining pockets of enemy resistance. By the conclusion of the Marshall Islands campaign, over 600 Americans had perished, with another 1,800 wounded, while Japanese casualties exceeded 9,000. Mere weeks after the initial landing, airstrips were swiftly constructed and Avenger squadrons were primed for the impending advance towards Japan. By June of 1944, the US fleet had solidified its control over Saipan and Guam. Concurrently, one of the most significant battles of World War II was unfolding, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, also referred to as the Marianas Turkey Shoot. This monumental clash between naval aviators would go down in history as the largest aerial battle ever waged between two carrier forces. High in the skies over the Philippine Sea, the Hellcat fighter reigned supreme. On the first day alone, the Japanese Navy lost 156 planes to American fighters. To differentiate torpedo bombers from their Japanese counterparts and to prevent confusion, Hellcat pilots adopted an unconventional tactic. They carried model airplanes, typically considered children's toys.
The Air Force or the Army at that time made they're made out of a very hard plastic material, and they used them to help train the pilots on identifying aircraft. They were normally just an all-black plastic, and they had these on all the Allied planes and all the German and Japanese planes, so that they could help teach the pilots and the aircraft gunners the various airplanes so they could identify them.
With a comprehensive fighter cover providing blanket protection, Avenger crews could focus their efforts on dropping bombs and torpedoes rather than engaging Japanese Zeros in combat. Relentless bombardment gradually weakened Japanese resistance, and by the conclusion of June, nearly all of the Marianas Islands had fallen under US control. With the Marianas firmly secured, the Navy turned its attention to the pivotal island of Guam. By late 1944, Japanese forces were clinging to their last remaining outposts in the South Pacific. In October, American fast carrier forces launched their decisive offensive against the Japanese, advancing towards Okinawa and Formosa. As the Pacific theatre of war progressed, Avenger squadrons increasingly transitioned from torpedo attacks against Japanese shipping to conducting bombing missions. From Luzon to Mindoro to the liberation of the Philippines, Avenger squadrons pounded relentlessly an enemy that was quickly losing its grip on the war. In a final bid to halt the advancing American fleet, the Japanese resorted to desperate measures. Sailors of the US Navy escort carrier group Taffy 1 were taken aback to witness Japanese aircraft diving straight towards their ships. This marked the first encounter for the Navy group with the notorious Kamikaze attacks. Employing a relentless barrage of anti-aircraft fire, the sailors endeavoured to block the skies, serving as the primary defence against the suicidal pilots. And although a few managed to hit American ships, most kamikazes found only the ocean at the end of their dive. Unfazed by the looming threat posed by the kamikazes, the American fleet pressed forward towards the Bonin Islands, situated a mere 750 miles south of Tokyo. Of particular importance was the main island of Iwo Jima. The Allies wanted it to establish a base for fighters that would later protect the B-29s slated to bomb Japan. In February and March of 1945, Avengers played a pivotal role in the two Iwo Jima campaigns, providing crucial close air support for the Marines engaged in combat on the island. Close air support was crucial, and after one of the most bitter struggles of the war, the victorious Marines raised the flag over Iwo Jima. Despite the US Navy's steady progress in the Pacific War, naval aviators faced relentless daily challenges. Landing a plane on a carrier deck with only one wheel was not a skill Navy pilots had trained for. It was something they had to learn on the job. During World War II, ejection seats were not available, leaving pilots with three options if their plane became disabled: jumping out, ditching the aircraft in the sea, or attempting a carrier landing, as demonstrated by this Hellcat pilot. Jumping out of a crippled plane was typically seen as a last resort due to the unreliability of parachutes and the risk of being struck by the tail of the aircraft during egress. Landing on the water was generally a safer bet, but only if the plane was responsive enough to turn upwind and be gently touched down. If the plane remained flyable, a carrier landing was the preferred option, although it still posed significant risks. The danger inherent in aviation was a constant reminder for the automakers of General Motors.
Weight was no problem with a car. In fact, people liked the heavier car because they felt it rode more safely. It was a better riding car. It was a safer car. But airplanes, every ounce of weight was very, very important because the lighter it is, the more it can carry, the more ammunition, the more guns, the better fighting machine it can be, the faster it can be. It's just a very different attitude. You had to build it light, strong, and rugged.
The Avenger, renowned for its ruggedness and inheriting the proud tradition of Grumman Ironworks, repeatedly demonstrated its ability to withstand considerable punishment and return safely to the ship. However, for Ensign George Bush of Torpedo Squadron 51, September 2, 1944 marked a day when his Avenger would not return to the ship. Departing from the USS San Jacinto that morning, Bush embarked on a mission that would profoundly alter his life.
Well, it was a momentous day in my life that I will never forget. September 2nd, 44, early in the morning. We had flown over Chichijima the day before, And so we were to go back again the next day.
A mission targeting a heavily defended radio station. With the fleet moving south, the station had to be hit on this mission.
This was the last day that the fleet was going to be under Admiral Michener in the north. Task Force 58 was soon to become Task Force 38 under Admiral Halsey. So I knew that the fleet would be leaving that evening. We'd been told that. This is your last mission over the Bonin Islands. Fleet's going south, which came to haunt me later on when I was floating around in the water, because I say, if they're going south and I'm sitting up here, it won't be too good.
En route to the target, the 4 Avengers divided into 2 pairs. Bush and his wingman were tasked with striking one radio station, while the other 2 Avengers targeted another station.
It was a rather clear day. Climbed to about 10 or 12,000 feet. Got the signal from our squadron leader to push over into a dive. We were doing what they call glide bombing. This plane was designed not to go almost straight down like a dive bomber, but in a glide. And we were carrying 400 or 500 pound bombs. My target was the radio station. And the minute we got over the target, or near the target, we could see that we were in for a rather warm reception, because the flak was all over these angry black puffs. And I pushed the plane over into a dive, and got halfway down, seeing this stuff breaking all around you. You could feel the plane go up like this, and suddenly it was engulfed in smoke and fire. And I did manage to finish the bombing run, and then pulled out over the ocean, and made a turn so the people in the back could get out.
After ensuring his crew members had ample time to bail out of the plane, Bush himself climbed onto the wing.
It was very scary. You couldn't hardly see the instruments. And I jumped and pulled the ripcord too early, and I hit my head on the tail of the airplane and ended up with a great big, like a strawberry in baseball, you know, when you slide, just rip the skin off. And ironically, the chute had hung up on just for a moment on the tail of the plane, ripped some of the panels out of this pie-cut parachute. And I looked up. I was dazed by that, came to, and there I was floating down into the Pacific. You could see the Japanese island right there very clearly. Landed in there. I'd forgotten to hook my seat pack, and so one of the fighter pilots dove down and showed me where that was. I swam over and got it, inflated it, climbed into the raft, and proceeded to set the record for the fastest yellow raft in the history of the Pacific, trying to go away against the wind, away from this island of Chichijima.
Hellcat pilots then strafed a Japanese boat dispatched to capture Bush, who was left alone in a life raft with minimal protection.
I was carrying a .38 caliber pistol. I knew enough about those islands to know that they were not kind to prisoners when they got them. In fact, the commandant of that place was later tried on a war crimes trial and was hung for eating the liver of the pilots. So I unflexed my .38, not knowing what the hell I'd do with it, and fortunately didn't have to do someone else in or myself in.
After spending nearly 3 hours in the raft, Bush spotted something emerging from the water roughly 100 yards away. This footage was captured aboard the American submarine USS Finback during the rescue of Bush from the waters off Chichijima. In 1945, General Motors celebrated the construction of their 7,000th Avenger. Just 4 years earlier, they were primarily manufacturing automobiles, yet by the war's end, they had produced over 3/4 of all Avengers for the Navy. This monumental conversion effort did not go unappreciated by President Truman, who visited the plant with the Secretary of Defense and a group of very grateful Navy admirals. Before Japan officially surrendered on September 2, 1945, Avengers were deployed in airfields across Japan. From their fateful beginnings at Midway to their crucial contributions against U-boats in the Atlantic, and ultimately to their triumphant presence in Tokyo, the Avenger, emblematic of the arsenal of democracy, remained steadfast throughout. Could industries throughout America ever again unite as they did during World War II?
Well, if we were told we can't build any more cars and we're going to have to do something with our people, I'm sure we would learn how to build whatever product the government wants us to build to support whatever major effort we're going after to win a war or what. I think that's just the American spirit.
The Avenger continued to serve with the Navy until 1955, albeit not in a combat capacity. During the Korean War, it was extensively utilized for cargo transport between Japan and the fleet. As the Cold War unfolded, the Avenger assumed a crucial role in the Navy's efforts to track down Soviet submarines. Additionally, various other Avenger variants, including the Sea Search variant equipped with the large searchlight in the bomb bay and the electronic countermeasures variant, briefly saw service with the Navy. Remarkably, the Avenger still takes to the skies today, a testament to its enduring legacy and the remarkable history of this iconic aircraft. From Alabama to Arizona, the pilots of the Jet 8 generation fly through peaceful skies in a living relic that once brought terror to Japanese ships and German U-boats. Today, the Avenger primarily participates in air shows and reunions, piloted by aviators who continue the legacy of a bygone era, a time when a tumultuous world erupted into chaos. It was an era when the industries of America rallied together in their own arduous battle, striving to forge a unified and formidable arsenal of democracy.
In June of 1942, a pivotal naval confrontation unfolded, marking one of the most significant battles of World War II as the United States of America faced off against the Japanese Empire. Fought exclusively with aircraft carriers positioned hundreds of miles apart, the Battle of Midway represented a groundbreaking naval conflict. It marked the inaugural major fleet engagement where opposing fleets never closed the gap to visually spot each other's ships. Victory or defeat depended not on the big guns of battleships, but on the carrier-borne bombers and torpedo bombers flying over vast tracts of ocean to seek and destroy their targets. Midway was the dawn of a new era in naval warfare. The Battle of Midway held paramount significance for Japan, as it was envisioned as the pivotal element in a grand strategy aimed at expanding the empire's territorial reach deep into the Pacific. Midway Island, a crucial American stronghold, was slated for assault and occupation, while the United States Pacific Fleet, en route to defend it with its scarce aircraft carriers, would fall into an ambush, leading to its annihilation. Should the remaining vestiges of American naval might be ultimately shattered, Japanese dominance over the Pacific would remain unassailable for the foreseeable future. In fact, in the Battle of Midway, the Japanese carrier fleet, the mightiest in existence, was utterly destroyed, and Japan suffered her greatest defeat for over 300 years. During the Battle of Midway, Japan, at the zenith of its military strength, suffered not only a significant naval defeat, but also, in the span of a single day, sealed the fate of the Japanese Empire, leading it toward downfall and defeat. Since the early 1930s, Japanese conquests in China had caused ever-increasing friction with the United States. Starting in mid-1940, the United States imposed a prohibition on the export of arms, scrap iron, and other critical strategic resources to the Japanese Empire. Then, in July 1941, America led an international oil embargo and froze all Japanese overseas assets. The effect was devastating. Up to now, 90% of Japan's oil had been imported, and her stockpiles were rapidly dwindling. As time grew scarce, the Japanese leadership made a momentous choice to embark on invasions and conquests of neighboring regions abundant in oil and other essential raw materials. First, a major obstacle would have to be eliminated: the American Pacific Fleet, anchored at Hawaii. In the early hours just prior to dawn on December 7, 1941, a fleet of 360 bombers and fighters took off from Japanese aircraft carriers positioned 230 miles north of Hawaii. Their target was the 3 carriers and the 8 battleships of the United States Pacific Fleet, based in Pearl Harbor. In the span of just 2 hours, a total of 18 American warships, including 6 battleships, were sent to the depths, while an additional 90 vessels sustained damage from bombs or torpedoes. Almost 200 planes were destroyed on the ground, and over 3,500 US personnel killed or wounded. The Japanese lost only 29 aircraft. It was a stunning victory. Shortly after noon the next day, the United States declared war on the Japanese Empire. Following the devastation of the US Pacific Fleet, the path was cleared for the Japanese campaign of expansion and conquest. In advance of the impending onslaught, garrisons across the region had covertly bolstered their defenses, and thousands of troops had been assembled and readied for action. In the hours following the Pearl Harbor raid, Japanese aircraft launched attacks on American air bases located at Wake Island, Guam, and Luzon in the Philippines. With complete air superiority, the Japanese launched their invasions. Forces in French Indochina, already held by the Japanese, rapidly advanced into Thailand and Burma. Troops from the island of Hainan landed in Malaya. On that very day, an initial raiding force commenced the invasion of the Philippines, swiftly followed by larger-scale landings. Over the next 3 weeks, Wake Island and Hong Kong fell to the Japanese. Borneo and Caleb were invaded and Sumatra was occupied. On February the 19th, Japanese aircraft carriers launched a lightning raid on Port Darwin in northern Australia, sinking 12 merchant ships and eliminating Darwin as a valuable Allied base. Early March saw the climax of the Japanese expansion, the inevitable occupation of Java. In a little over 3 months, Japan had conquered 1/4 of the Pacific Ocean. By securing a stable oil supply and expanding the defensive perimeter around their homeland, Japan had successfully accomplished all of its immediate wartime objectives. Yet in spite of the breathtaking scale of the Japanese victories, there did remain one major threat to the security of her Pacific conquests. 3 aircraft carriers from the United States Pacific Fleet managed to elude the devastation at Pearl Harbor, and within a matter of weeks, each of them served as a central core for a newly formed task force. After minor raids on the Marshall and Gilbert Islands, 2 of the American carriers set sail on one of the most audacious missions of the Pacific War, to bomb Tokyo, the heart of the Japanese Empire. In early April 1942, the aircraft carrier Hornet embarked on a westward journey from the U.S. naval base in Alameda, California, to meet up with its sister ship, the Enterprise, which was sailing from Pearl Harbor. With adept maneuvering to bypass the protective string of Japanese-controlled islands, both the Hornet and the Enterprise managed to penetrate to a point within 825 miles of Japan's coastline. At 8:24 on the 18th of April, 16 Mitchells took off from the Hornet and struck a course for the Japanese capital. Flying low, they avoided Japan's fighter defenses, and 15 aircraft dropped their bombs on the city. All but one of the Mitchells escaped to safety in mainland China or Russia. Following the attack, famously referred to as the Doolittle Raid, which took its name from its commander, Japanese military leaders were deeply alarmed and concerned. Even though the raid had inflicted only minor physical damage, it delivered a significant blow to Japan's sense of national pride. The need to protect the emperor was at the very core of the armed forces' being, and an agony of shame swept through the high command. Japan's leaders swiftly arrived at the conclusion that there was just one means by which they could ensure the adequate protection of homeland and the emperor. The frontiers of the empire must be pushed even further into the Pacific. In October 1941, General Hideki Tojo had been appointed Prime Minister of Imperial Japan. In his role as the Army Chief of Staff, Tojo harbored a profound ambition to witness the successful culmination of the Japanese campaign in China. He firmly believed that the sole path to achieving this goal was to secure a decisive victory over the Western powers. On his appointment as Prime Minister, General Tojo had kept his post as Chief of Staff and the job of War Minister. However, although an immensely powerful figure, Tojo did not have the complete control of government policy. Within a cabinet comprising representatives from all branches of the armed forces, he could rely primarily on the backing of the army. Consequently, most decisions ultimately resulted from a compromise between the army and the navy. Even prior to the Doolittle Raid, expanding the empire's boundaries into the Pacific had been a cherished aspiration of a powerful naval faction. After the raid, arguments between the army and navy evaporated. Because the proposed operation would demand little army participation, Tojo finally gave his support. Franklin D. Roosevelt had been elected President of the United States in 1932. Strongly against the prevailing sentiment of isolationism, Roosevelt had the conviction that America should actively engage on the global stage. Even before the outbreak of war in Europe, Roosevelt had warned of the dangers posed by Nazi Germany's ambitions. Following the German conquest of the continent in 1940, Roosevelt, despite facing domestic opposition, progressively bolstered his support for Britain in its battle for survival. It was also Roosevelt who, in relation for Japanese actions against China, had imposed the oil and trade embargo on Japan. As a former Assistant Secretary to the Navy and now its Commander-in-Chief, Roosevelt took a special interest in the service. He handpicked his own flag officers and staff members, driven by his unwavering belief that the Navy should be led by the most qualified individuals for the roles. In a testament to his commitment to competence, he appointed Frank Knox, a member of the opposition Republican Party, to head the Navy Department. Under Roosevelt and Knox, the naval budget steadily rose. Even following the events at Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt maintained a belief that ran contrary to the desires of the American public. He believed that a war in Europe should take precedence over actions in the Pacific. He understood that enormous resources would be needed to push back the tide of the Japanese conquest, and until the full might of American industry could be brought to bear. The United States would have to concentrate on holding the line. Roosevelt insisted that further Japanese expansion must be counted at all costs. The Imperial High Command anticipated that the expansion of the Japanese defense perimeter in the Pacific, while presenting logistical complexities, would pose minimal substantive challenges. On the islands to be invaded, enemy forces were weak, and at sea, it seemed there was little to fear from the Americans or the British. The Japanese Navy, the diving force behind the plan, was supremely confident. The first stage of the Japanese plan of conquest was to complete the occupation of New Guinea. As of April 1942, a portion of New Guinea had already fallen under Japanese control, and they were eager to prevent the Allies from gaining control over the entire island. An advanced striking force of troop transports and heavy cruisers would be assembled in Rabaul along with the 3 aircraft carriers of Truk. The forces from Rabaul would sail south, then split into 2 divisions. The first was to seize Laggy and the Solomon Islands. The second, supported by 1 aircraft carrier from Truk, was to capture Port Moresby. The remaining 2 carriers would enter the Coral Sea and engage any enemy found there. Once New Guinea had been occupied, then New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa would easily be captured. In order to expand the Japanese front in the northern region, 3 islands within the Aleutian chain, Attu, Kiska, and Adak, were slated for conquest. The next stage in the Japanese advance would be the occupation of the American-held island of Midway, 1,136 miles west of Hawaii. Seizing Midway would secure an airstrip for the Empire within a range that could threaten the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. Although the capture of Midway would provide a vital stepping stone in any future action against Hawaii, the operation would also have another equally important objective. It would be used to lure American aircraft carriers out of Pearl Harbor and force them to fight a battle that would end in their destruction. The strategy for capturing Midway and defending the American carrier fleet was a multifaceted and intricate amalgamation of invasion, diversion, reaction, and ambush tactics. The first step in the Midway offensive would be the dispatch of a Japanese submarine fleet to set up to reconnaissance cordons, one 500 miles west of Pearl Harbor and the other between Hawaii and Midway. As the submarines assumed their designated positions, a Midway occupation force, comprising troop ships accompanied by a division of heavy cruisers, would depart from the Marianas and proceed northeast towards Midway. In order to incapacitate Midway's defenses and stage an ambush against the American carrier fleet, a formidable carrier strike force was organized, consisting of 4 aircraft carriers backed by battleships, heavy cruisers, and a robust destroyer screen. The carriers and their support would sortie east through the Bungo Channel. They would be followed by a main force of 6 battleships. In the northern region, a second task force comprising carriers and transports, escorted by cruisers, destroyers, and battleships, would launch an attack on the Aleutian Islands. The Aleutians' operation had a secondary purpose. It would divert the Americans from the impending attack on Midway, tempting them to send the carrier north. In order to intercept any U.S. warships dispatched from Pearl Harbor, the Japanese fleet would be strategically repositioned to lay in wait. To the south, the Japanese carrier strike force would approach within 250 miles of Midway and attack the airfield, hangars, and shoreline installations. The invasion would quickly follow. As the Midway landings were in progress, the carrier strike force and the main force battleships redeployed 500 miles from the island would lie in wait. Upon the departure of the American fleet from Pearl Harbor and their detection by the submarine surveillance perimeter around Hawaii, or the long-range reconnaissance patrols originating from the Marshall Islands, the Japanese carriers would move into engagement. The big guns of the main force battleships would then finish the remnants of American sea power in the Pacific. By the spring of 1942, the Japanese Navy code JN-25 had been partially broken by U.S. naval intelligence. However, the cipher was complex, and many messages still remained difficult to understand. Commander Joseph Rochefort was head of the Naval Communications Intelligence Unit at Pearl Harbor. It was Rochefort who finally succeeded in adding a piece of the cipher jigsaw, vital to the Midway operation. By early May, Rochefort had a strong suspicion that a major attack was being planned for Midway based on partially deciphered Japanese messages. However, obtaining confirmation was challenging, and alternative interpretations remained plausible. The code that the Japanese used to represent the island was unknown, but was supposed to be the letters AF. Rochefort designed a simple ruse, which was given the go-ahead by his superiors, prompting Rochefort to coordinate an urgent request from the island for a freshwater tanker. 2 days later, on the 12th of May, an American listening post picked up a Japanese radio message AF is short of water. It was clear that the coded messages referring to an attack on AF meant that Midway was the true objective of Japan's coming operation. Already, the Japanese plan was fatally compromised. While the Americans would face a significant numerical disadvantage in the impending battle, the efforts of the code breakers at Pearl Harbor allowed them to make a more precise estimation of the likely date of the attack, narrowing it down to a range between June 4th and June 8th. Knowing that the Japanese invasion of the Aleutians was merely a feint, the Pacific Fleet could afford to concentrate its strongest naval force in the Midway area. Moreover, being aware that Japanese aircraft carriers would be positioned in ambush, the Americans could disregard the invading forces and concentrate their efforts entirely on targeting the enemy carriers. The United States had a precise asset in the island of Midway itself. Dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and even B-17s could be stationed there to attack the Japanese fleet. As an unsinkable airbase, the island held immense value as a contingency landing strip for carrier-based aircraft that might be damaged or running low on fuel. In addition, Midway had 2 old but powerful radars, which could be used to help detect and track Japanese attacks. The United States naval strategy to counter the Japanese operation at Midway was meticulously crafted to leverage every advantage held by the Americans. The American defense of Midway would hinge on the ability of 2 carrier task forces to find and destroy the Japanese fleet. Task Force 16, based around the carriers Enterprise and Hornet, would be the first to sail from Pearl Harbor. Task Force 17, with the carrier Yorktown, would follow 2 days later. All three carriers would rendezvous at Point Luck, 325 miles northeast of Midway. As the Japanese carrier strike force approached the area, the problem of the Americans would be finding it. The radar systems on American carriers had a limited range of 150 miles. If the carrier's own reconnaissance patrols couldn't establish contact, the fleet would need to depend on long-range aircraft stationed on Midway Island. Midway's reconnaissance Catalinas would fly 700 miles out to sea in search of the Japanese. In the event that the enemy fleet was detected, the Catalina aircraft would shadow it until it entered the range of the Midway radar station. Midway radar would then keep the pursuing American carriers fully informed. An all-out attack of land and carrier-based aircraft could then be accurately vectored in to destroy the Japanese strike force. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the strategy to defeat the United States Navy at Midway, assumed the role of Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet in 1939. A dynamic and powerful personality, Yamamoto had little regard for the abilities of his superiors, and he was well aware that they were intimidated by his standing and his track record. Yamamoto's remarkable achievements as the orchestrator of the Pearl Harbor attack and subsequent Pacific triumphs granted him significant latitude in formulating and executing offensive strategies. Yamamoto's resolve to have his strategies adopted was so unwavering that he often resorted to threatening resignation if his plans were not embraced. In his youth, Yamamoto had studied at Harvard University and, as a graduate, had served in Washington as naval attaché. Knowing the United States intimately, Yamamoto greatly feared America's industrial might. Prior to the events at Pearl Harbor, he had made efforts to persuade his superiors about the potential risks Japan would confront in a protracted conflict with the United States. However, once he realized that Japan was committed to war, Yamamoto was determined to win it, his way. The destruction of the American fleet at Midway would buy Japan much-needed time. Yamamoto's aspirations centered on the concept of the Kasen Kantai, the pivotal and conclusive battle that would compel the Americans to engage in peace negotiations. He understood that a fleet engagement was a reckless gamble, but as an inveterate poker and shogi player, he was convinced that the only possibility of a victory lay in staking everything on just one card. Admiral Chester Nimitz, a gifted strategist and organizer, had been appointed Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet on the 31st of December 1941, immediately after the Japanese raid on Pearl Harbor. Nimitz held the belief that the tragedy at Pearl Harbor was not attributable to incompetence, and his subsequent policy of keeping all officers in their positions significantly boosted morale within the American Pacific Fleet. Nimitz's personable style of management plus a remarkable gift for trusting subordinates to do their jobs without interference would prove crucial in the battle ahead. Following the Pearl Harbor attack, it was Chester Nimitz who recognized that the era of the formidable battleship armed with big guns was coming to an end. He understood that the future striking power of America's Navy would be centered around the aircraft carrier. While under Nimitz's direction, America's carrier-building system was accelerated, for the moment, he would have to make do with what he had, just 4 aircraft carriers and their support ships. In spite of his slender resources, Nimitz would stick to the tactical doctrine he had always advocated. For aircraft carriers, attack is the best form of defense. To the Japanese Navy, the outcome of the forthcoming battle was never in doubt. So far, the war had yielded an unbroken string of successes, and the certainty of victory was shared by all ranks. The confidence was so high that some flag officers harbored a genuine concern that the Americans might be hesitant to engage in combat and choose to remain within the secure confines of Pearl Harbor. One advanced seaplane squadron even sent a signal to its headquarters, requesting that all future mail should be directed to Midway. The results of war games simulating the coming battle were also ignored. When a scenario of this nature led to the involvement of American bombers from Midway Island and the subsequent destruction of 2 Japanese carriers, the final outcome was deemed unacceptable and was overridden by the imperial authorities. For the massive undertaking that would expand the Japanese Empire and destroy the U.S. Navy in the Pacific, Japan could muster almost its entire combined fleet. All 9 of the fleet's battleships, along with 11 carriers, could take part in the coming operations. Of these, 4 carriers eventually participate in the Battle of Midway. Akagi, or Red Castle, was laid down as a battlecruiser in 1920. 2 years later, she was converted into an aircraft carrier. In 1934, Akagi was extensively modified to accommodate 30 more aircraft, taking her battle complement to 91. Akagi was only one of 2 carriers ever built, with the bridge on the port side. Kaga, or Increased Joy, was originally laid down as a battleship, but in 1924, work began to convert her into a carrier. She was completed in March 1928. Later, Kaga's triple deck was replaced by a much lengthened single deck and a major refit. Her aircraft capacity was raised from 60 to 90. Soryu, the Green Dragon, was launched in December 1935. Built under the limitations of the Washington Naval Treaty, Soryu was small and cramped. Nevertheless, she could still carry 63 aircraft. And the design was so successful, she was the model for the nearly all later Japanese carriers. Kiryu, the Flying Dragon, like Akagi, had her bridge on the port side. Because of the universal tendency of pilots to veer to the left in emergency, the design caused many more landing accidents. Kiryu was, however, very much more seaworthy than her predecessors. Her complement of aircraft was 63. The Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter was the most potent and visible symbol of Japanese prowess in the Pacific War. Purpose-designed as a Navy fighter to operate from land bases and aircraft carriers, the Zero would acquire an awesome reputation. The Zero had a remarkably clean airframe and was very light in weight. The result was high speed and excellent fuel economy. However, these advantages were achieved at the expense of pilot protection. The Zero had no armor and no self-sealing fuel tanks. More Zeros would be built than any other Japanese aircraft. The Aichi D-3A Val 2-seater was the first all-metal monoplane dive bomber to enter Japanese naval service. In the hands of experts, the Val was a formidable weapon, realizing an 80% strike accuracy during the early Japanese conquests. The aircraft was constructed with such robustness and maneuverability that even with a fixed undercarriage, it could transform into a highly proficient fighter once it had released its bombs. Although the Nakajima B-5N Kate was slow and poorly protected, it was at the time of Midway the best aircraft of its type in the world. On its introduction in 1937, it had boasted many advanced features such as folding wings, a retractable undercarriage, and integral wing fuel tanks. Effective as a conventional bomber, as a torpedo bomber, the Kate was devastating. The aircraft was armed with the excellent Type 91 torpedo. The Type 91 could be released at a speed of 200 miles an hour and from an altitude of up to 300 meters, providing valuable protection against anti-aircraft fire. The naval pilots preparing for New Guinea and Midway operations were seasoned veterans of the attack on Pearl Harbor. They had gone to fly on combat missions in the Pacific and Indian Oceans. For Japanese pilots, the intervals between combat operations were entirely taken up by training. The motto was, train hard, fight easy. Japanese determination to achieve the highest standards in Navy flying had not come without a price. Pilot training was lengthy and expensive. Only 100 naval pilots graduated annually from the training schools, which proved insufficient to meet the continuous demands imposed on Japanese carrier forces since the war began. There had been no leave for Navy aircrew. The training of Japanese sailors and flight deck personnel was, if anything, even more arduous than that undergone by their pilot comrades. These men were conscripts, toughened by rigorous discipline and relentless battle training that ensured that a ship could be swiftly prepared for action stations, and a full strike force could be launched within 5 minutes. During the heat of battle, a flight could be rearmed, refueled, and airborne again within 1 hour. Although the combat readiness of Japanese sailors and airmen was unsurpassed, there was an underlying weakness in the Navy's preparation for the coming operations. Before Pearl Harbor, aircrew had been able to practice 4 bomb runs a day, and dive bombers had been expected to score 80% hit rates or better. There had also been extensive fleet maneuvers. Now, amidst the exacerbated fuel shortages that ignited the war, maneuvers and bombing practice faced even stricter limitations. At Midway, the consequences for the Imperial Navy would be nothing short of catastrophic. Soon after the attack on Pearl Harbor, it had become clear to senior American naval commanders that although the damage done was severe, it was far from the fatal blow the Japanese had intended. The Pacific Fleet's priceless aircraft carriers had escaped. The Japanese had been unsuccessful in their attempts to obliterate the ship repair yards, and they had overlooked the fuel depots at the bases, leaving substantial oil reserves untouched. In spite of Japanese efforts, Pearl Harbor still played host to a powerful American naval presence. Hawaii was the base for the United States' 3 Pacific Fleet carriers, plus 1/4 transferred from the Atlantic Fleet. Each carrier was supported by its screen of up to 2 heavy cruisers and 5 destroyers. Nearly 20 submarines protected the waters around Oahu and Midway Island. Due to Admiral Nimitz's conviction that the Japanese Navy's overwhelming superiority made it one-hit-run tactics feasible, the sluggish Pacific Fleet battleships were excluded from any role in the forthcoming operation. Those that had been repaired after the Pearl Harbor attack were sent to San Francisco to patrol the west coast of the United States. Everything would now depend on the speed and long-range hitting power of the American carriers. All 3 of the carriers that would take part in the Battle of Midway were the Yorktown class. Commissioned by October 1941, the ships were Yorktown, Hornet, and Enterprise. Although slightly slower than its Japanese equivalent, the Yorktown class was capable of carrying an extra 20 aircraft. Yorktown carriers were notable for their advanced damage control systems. In order to reduce the risk of firing during an impending enemy attack, aviation gas fuel lines could be filled with carbon dioxide. The carrier's decks were also specially designed for combat conditions. The flight deck was unarmored and constructed with 6-inch planks of teak, more easily repaired than metal and less likely to cause severe splinter wounds to crewmen. Unlike the Japanese carriers, the Yorktowns were all equipped with radar, which could detect aircraft flying up to 30,000 feet and at a range of over 100 miles. While the Lexington would not participate in the Battle of Midway, it would assume a crucial role in the earlier engagement, the Battle of the Coral Sea. Lexington had been laid down as a battlecruiser in 1921 and converted during construction. She emerged as America's first fleet carrier and one of the largest aircraft carriers in the world. Because Lexington was a very early design, her available deck and hangar space was not efficiently used, and her aircraft complement was a modest 63. Originally conceived as a biplane carrier fighter, the Grumman Wildcat was redesigned as a mid-wing monoplane during the planning stages. The aircraft entered U.S. Navy service in 1939 and was manufactured first by Grumman and later by General Motors. Powered by a Wright Cyclone 9-cylinder radial engine, the Wildcat was slower than its opposite number, the Zero. Nonetheless, its exceptional maneuverability, formidable 6-gun armament, effective armor, and robust construction meant that the Wildcats could frequently endure battle damage that would be catastrophic for any other fighter. Nearly 8,000 Wildcats would see service in World War II. From its introduction in June 1940, the Douglas Dauntless was one of the most important American combat aircraft of the war. In the first half of 1942, the Dauntless saw more action than any other type. The Dauntless was a dive bomber with heavy armor, a bulletproof windscreen, and self-sealing fuel tanks. It was powered by a 9-cylinder Wright Cyclone radial engine. Because of its great stability in flight, the aircraft was known affectionately to its pilots as the Barge. When it first entered service with the U.S. Navy, the Dauntless was the best carrier-based dive bomber in the world. The aircraft would take credit for sinking more Japanese shipping than any other Allied weapon, and during the Battle of Midway, it would be responsible for all Japanese ship losses. The three-man Douglas Devastator, America's first carrier monoplane, had entered service in 1937, and by 1942 was already obsolete. It was slow, lightly armed, and had a poor rate of climb. At Midway, Devastators would suffer appalling losses, and the battle would be the aircraft's last major action of the war. The Grumman TBF was initially conceived as a replacement for the Devastator, and despite its rapid design process, it would ultimately establish itself as the most successful torpedo bomber of World War II. The TBF was a robust and powerful three-seater aircraft. It was the first American naval warplane to mount a power-operated turret, and the only to carry its torpedo internally. The TBF entered service in early 1942, but only 6 were available for the Battle of Midway. All were stationed on Midway Island. It would be the TBF's first combat action, and in the memory of the men lost during the battle, the aircraft would afterwards be renamed the Avenger. The consolidated PBY Catalina would become one of the most successful flying boats of World War II, and the most numerous flying boat ever. The Catalina was unique as the first flying boat to feature cantilever wings which needed no supporting spars. It also had established floats, which could be retracted to form the wingtips in flight. The resulting aerodynamic efficiency made for speed and long range. After the first 4 marks of the PBY flying boat, the aircraft was fitted with retractable tricycle landing gear to give it an amphibious capability. While capable of carrying a substantial bomb load, it was the long-range reconnaissance capability of the Catalina that proved to be invaluable to the Americans during the Battle of Midway. Catalinas would also save the lives of many ditched American flyers. The B-17, a 4-engine heavy bomber, had first entered service with the United States Army in June 1939. Despite the aircraft's later fame as a strategic bomber, its original specification was actually for a long-range anti-shipping weapon, a role it would indeed fulfill during the Battle of Midway, driven by political considerations. The B-17E fully lived up to its designation as a flying fortress, intended to operate in self-defending formations. The B-17E mounted 2 hydraulically operated turrets, one of them a retractable ball underneath the aircraft. Altogether, the fortress carried 11 machine guns and was fitted with self-sealing fuel tanks and extensive armor. Despite its size and power, the B-17 had a low wing loading, making it more likely to return its crew home even when sustaining heavy combat damage compared to other aircraft of its class. In the Battle of Midway, 19 B-17s of the U.S. Army Air Force would operate against the Japanese. To extend their range, they would carry extra fuel tanks and half their normal bomb load. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor had united the American people at a single stroke. Military and civilians alike shared a bitter resolve to see the Japanese totally defeated. Across the country, hundreds of thousands flocked to the recruitment centers. The impact of the Japanese attack had been particularly deep felt by the personnel of the United States Navy, and this humiliation had infused even the most routine training exercises with extraordinary level of intensity. Unlike the Japanese, whose trainee naval pilots were an elite selected at 14 years of age, the Americans recruited from a much wider segment of the population. In the United States, there were far more suitably educated recruits with the right mental and physical qualities for a carrier pilot. On America's entry into the war, the training schools were easily expanded without any appreciable fall-off in quality. After 3 months of elementary flying instruction, the aspiring naval pilots spent another 3 months in basic Navy training. Periods at 2 more flight schools were followed, and only the best were selected for training as carrier pilots. Despite the high quality of U.S. Navy flight training, American carrier pilots would enter combat with significantly less flight experience, having amassed just over half the 700 hours of flying time achieved by their Japanese counterparts. They had also, as yet, seen little combat. Some of them had participated in raids on the Gilbert and Marshall Islands, primarily organized for training and morale-boosting purposes rather than significant strategic objectives. These actions, however, were relatively minor and encountered minimal serious opposition. As for the flight deck crew, American performance was at least as effective as the Japanese. The men were just as capable of launching a wave of strike aircraft within 5 minutes. Where the Americans did have a real edge on the enemy was in damage control. Damage control parties were highly trained in their duties, and their ability to deal with fire, the greatest threat to any warship, was unsurpassed. During the Battle of Midway, the comparative damage control abilities of each side would emerge as a crucial determinant in shaping the battle's outcome. By late April 1942, preparations for the Japanese campaign were well underway. Naval facilities at the port of Rabaul had been greatly expanded, and thousands of troops had been assembled ready for the conquest of New Guinea and Tulagi. The troops' transports were ready to sail, along with the escorts of cruisers and destroyers. The Japanese anticipated little opposition on Tulagi, and once the island had been captured, the Port Moresby assault would follow. In both cases, the Japanese expected that surprise would be on their side. As the 3 Japanese aircraft carriers, which had gathered for their mission, readied themselves to carry out their jobs, one to escort the Port Moresby invasion force, and the other 2 to assume positions in the Coral Sea, the Americans acted decisively. A task force based around the carriers Yorktown and Lexington was sent racing to intercept the Japanese. On May the 1st, south of the Solomon Islands, the carriers rendezvoused with a powerful force of Australian cruisers. The stage was now set for the Battle of the Coral Sea, marking the initial engagement in an epic confrontation that would ultimately alter the course of the Pacific War. The capture of the island of Tulagi on May the 3rd, 1942 was, as the Japanese expected, simply a matter of dropping anchor and disembarking the troops. Tulagi's tiny garrison of Australians had already been evacuated. The first blow in Japan's great campaign of expansion had apparently gone strictly to plan. Unbeknownst to the Japanese, the American carrier Yorktown with Admiral Fletcher aboard had received intelligence regarding the deployments in Tulagi and was already underway, heading north. At 7 a.m. on the morning after the Tulagi landings, Yorktown struck. 40 of Fletcher's aircraft were launched against the Japanese fleet and the occupation force. In little over an hour, the American bombers and torpedo bombers had sunk or damaged the destroyer, 3 minesweepers, a number of landing craft, and several seaplanes. For the Japanese, it was the first unsettling evidence that American carriers lurked in the area. On already the second day of operations, events were already taking an ominous turn. By the following day, Yorktown and her escorts had already to rendezvous with Lexington. The 2 escort groups now merged to form a single screen around the carriers. They had joined forces only just in time. The Japanese carriers Chokaku and Zuikaku had entered the Coral Sea, and the 2 fleets were now just 70 miles apart. On the morning of May the 7th, the American carrier task force with Lexington and Yorktown was cruising on a northwesterly course. The Japanese carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku were sailing on parallel course. Each fleet was unaware of the other's presence. American scout planes sent to the northeast failed to find the Japanese carriers, but as soon as they heard, the Americans launched a strike force of 93 aircraft. In fact, the ships sided with the cruisers and destroyers of the New Guinea invasion force, but soon after the Shoho was spotted only 25 miles away, and the attack was redirected. Shoho was hit by 13 bombs and 7 torpedoes. She sank within minutes. For the Imperial Navy, the loss of Shoho was deeply traumatic. So shocked were the Japanese commanders that the invasion of Port Moresby was immediately cancelled and the troop ships returned back to Rabaul. On the American side, there was jubilation. A pilot's radio report of the Shoho sinking, Scratch 1 flat top, would become one of the most famous signals of the Pacific War. After the sinking of the Shoho, Admiral Fletcher did not immediately launch another strike against the Japanese invasion fleet. To attack the carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku was his main objective, and in any case, the Japanese might themselves attack, and he would need his air defense at full strength. As the day advanced, a weather front closed in on the Japanese carriers. Nevertheless, the strike force commander, Admiral Tagaki, was determined to destroy the Americans before they could inflict yet more damage on the retreating Japanese invasion fleet. Choosing his best night flyers, Tagaki launched his attack in the late afternoon. The aircraft would have to return and land in darkness. The Japanese raiders, in spite of the poor weather, passed close to the American carrier group. The Americans, with the benefit of radar, easily detected the enemy formations and vectored their fighters to intercept. In a series of vicious dogfights, 10 Japanese aircraft were shot down. 11 more would crash after the mission, trying to land in darkness. For the Japanese, the raid was a fiasco. In the aftermath of this first carrier clash between the Imperial Navy and the U.S. Pacific Fleet, both sides considered attacking by night with their cruisers and destroyers. Both finally rejected the idea, fearing the absence of their protective screens. Instead, they withdrew, postponing the main action for another day. On the morning of May the 8th, the American and Japanese fleets were more than 100 miles apart. The Japanese had the benefit of low cloud cover, while the Americans were exposed under the clear blue skies. At 0600, both sides launched their reconnaissance aircraft, and within 2 hours, each fleet had discovered the other. On the American side, Yorktown and Lexington launched 70 bombers and torpedo bombers and 6 fighters. At almost the same time, Shokaku and Zuikaku launched 50 attack aircraft and 20 fighters. Although the Japanese carriers were close together, Zuikaku was hidden by a cloud, and it was Shokaku who fell victim to the Americans. She was hit by 3 bombs and so badly damaged that she would later be unable to recover her aircraft. Most would be forced to ditch into the sea. The American carriers, using their radar, detected the approaching Japanese raiders 70 miles away. 12 Wildcat fighters were scrambled, but only 3 reached a high enough altitude to attack, and no Japanese aircraft were destroyed. Yorktown was first to be hit. A single bomb found its target. The next victim was the larger and less maneuverable Lexington. 2 bombs struck her deck, inflicting minor damage. But far more seriously, 2 torpedoes impacted her port side. Even after the Japanese bombs and torpedoes had struck, Lexington continued to fight. But soon after the battle, she began to list to port. By pumping oil from one side of the carrier to the other, the crew managed to right the vessel, and she was soon capable of maintaining 24 knots. It looked as if Lexington might be able to reach home under her own steam. However, at 14:45, an explosion ripped through the carrier, and soon fires were raging out of control. The order was given to abandon ship, and after her crew had been taken off, a destroyer was detailed to sink the hell-blazing hulk with torpedoes. 38 aircraft were still on board. The destruction of Lexington meant that the Battle of the Coral Sea was a tactical victory for the Japanese. The light carrier Shoho had been exchanged for the far more formidable Lexington. However, the Imperial Navy had been far more badly damaged than it seemed. The carrier Shokaku was out of action, and Zuikaku's aircrew had been slaughtered. As a result, neither carrier would be able to participate in the decisive battle soon to be fought at Midway. In the aftermath of the Coral Sea battle, the Japanese made a fatal error. They knew they had sunk the Lexington, but they also believed that Yorktown had been smashed beyond repair. Even with 2 of their own heavy carriers out of action and the loss of the Shoho, they were certain that the balance was still in their favor. The remaining Japanese carriers, supported by battleships and heavy cruisers, would still have more than enough firepower to send the American Pacific Fleet to the bottom of the ocean. The Japanese main force for the Battle of Midway was based in Hashirajima in Japan. The main force was commanded by Admiral Yamamoto himself. Yamamoto had 7 battleships, 3 light cruisers, 2 seaplane carriers, 1 light carrier, and 20 destroyers. Attached to the main force was Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's carrier strike force, the most powerful carrier fleet at that time in the world. His heavy cruisers, Hiryu, Soryu, Akagi, and Kaga, would be escorted by 2 fast battleships, 3 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The Midway Invasion Force was commanded by Admiral Nobukate Kondo. Its main body was made up of 2 battleships, 4 heavy cruisers, 1 light carrier, and 7 destroyers. Subordinate to Admiral Kondo was the Midway Occupation Force commanded by Rear Admiral Reisa Tanaka. Tanaka had 12 transports with 5,000 troops and a screen of 1 light cruiser, 10 destroyers, and 3 patrol boats. At the Guams and the Marianas was the Midway Support Force under the command of Rear Admiral Taeko Korita. Korita had 4 heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers. As well as his Midway forces, Admiral Yamamoto had an overall command of the Aleutians fleet. Based in the anchorage of Ominato in the northern island of the Japanese homeland. The northern force was made up of a carrier striking force with 1 heavy and 1 light carrier, 2 cruisers, and 3 destroyers. There was also an invasion fleet of 4 transports carrying 1,000 soldiers accompanied by a 7-strong destroyer screen. With the Lexington sunk and the Yorktown badly damaged in the Coral Sea, the U.S. Pacific Fleet had been critically weakened. Yorktown went to the dry dock in Pearl Harbor with damage estimated to need at least 3 months to repair. In fact, the yards achieved near miraculous results. The job was done in 3 days, with 1,500 men working around the clock. How much minor damage had not yet been put right, and as the carrier sailed, scores of dockyard crew remained on board. Admiral Chester Nimitz, overall commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, would stay in Pearl Harbor throughout the Battle of Midway. Communicating with the ships by radio, Nimitz divided his carriers into 2 task forces. Task Force 17 was commanded by Admiral Frank Fletcher, veteran of the Coral Sea. Fletcher had Yorktown as his flagship, 2 cruisers and 6 destroyers. Fletcher also had operational command of Task Force 16, led by Admiral Raymond Spruance. Spruance had the carriers Enterprise and Hornet, along with 2 cruisers and 11 destroyers. From Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz deployed 19 submarines for reconnaissance and attack, which would patrol off Midway and Hawaii. He would also call on aircraft based on the island of Midway itself. The U.S. Army Air Force had 4 B-26s and 19 B-17E bombers. The Marines fielded 20 Buffalo and 7 Wildcat fighters. They also had 11 Vindicator and 16 Dauntless bombers. The Navy had 38 Catalinas and 6 TBF torpedo bombers. The island was also defended by the 6th Marine Defense Battalion of 3,000 men. On the morning of May the 27th, the Japanese carrier strike force under Admiral Nagumo sailed from Hashirajima. By nightfall, they had entered the Pacific and were heading for Midway. The following day, the Aleutians invasion force and the main body of warships sorted from Ominato. At the same time, far to the south, the Midway Invasion Force, with its escort of destroyers and invasion support force of heavy cruisers, sorted from the Marianas. Last to leave port, on the 29th, were the invasion force main body and Yamamoto's fleet, each of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Although Admiral Nimitz and his senior commanders knew that Midway was to be invaded, for security reasons, no one on the island was told that the mightiest concentration of naval power in history was bearing down upon them. Piecemeal, Midway's marine garrison was reinforced and the island's anti-aircraft defenses were strengthened. Every day, the Catalina flying boats patrol the ocean around the island in greater numbers. Although none of their crew knew yet precisely what they were searching for. The Japanese, too, had begun their reconnaissance effort. An advanced submarine force had been at sea for many days, racing towards Hawaii. Its task would be to set up a picket north of Pearl Harbor and report the strength of any American fleet dispatched to Midway. The submarines were in fact already too late. On May the 28th, Task Force 16 left Pearl Harbor unobserved, followed by Task Force 17 on the 30th. Both groups vanished into the Pacific Ocean, and the Japanese submarines, which would finally arrive on June 3rd, would watch in vain. By June the 2nd, the Japanese Northern Force was plowing its way through the Northern Pacific, towards the Aleutians. The island, although of immense strategic importance to the United States, were sparsely manned, the only forces of any consequence deployed at Dutch Harbor. The Americans, expecting the Japanese attack, flew repeated reconnaissance missions, but because of poor weather, failed to locate the enemy. The Japanese at first feared little better, but a second strike group did succeed in bombing Dutch Harbor. Over the following days, troops from the Special Naval Landing Force occupied Kiska and Attu. Although the Aleutians operation was in tactical terms a complete success, and the Japanese occupation of the islands would be a thorn in the American side for some time to come, the primary objective of the invasion had failed. The Americans, instead of dispatching strong naval forces north away from Midway, ignored the diversion. A key element in the Japanese plan failed completely. While the Japanese Northern Force was launching its attack on the Aleutians, hundreds of miles to the south, Nagumo's carrier strike force was fast approaching Midway. 200 miles behind Will Yamamoto's main force battleships and steaming from the southwest, the Midway invasion fleet. With no cloud cover, the invasion flotilla was desperately exposed, and by now, Midway's Catalinas were sweeping a huge arc of ocean, up to 700 miles, covering all the likely approaches to the island. It was on June 3rd, at 0900 hours, that a Catalina made the first sighting of Japanese ships off Midway. The pilot reported 2 cargo vessels. 21 minutes later, another Catalina, flown by Ensign Jack Reed, and just beyond the extreme limit of its allotted search, spotted a large formation of ships. The message dispatched to Midway read, "Sighted main body," and a few minutes later gave its bearing and range. Although the distance, 700 miles, was within the capabilities of Midway's B-17 bombers, which already had their extra fuel tanks fitted and were armed and waiting, Midway's commanders were unwilling to commit their forces without more information. It would be another 2 hours of steadily mounting tension before a radio message confirmed the sighting of a large body of Japanese warships. Meanwhile, reports of the sighting were passed on to the American carriers. The 2 American carrier task forces were waiting 325 miles to the northeast of Midway. The Catalina's report placed the Japanese main body to the southwest. However, Nimitz was confident of his intelligence sources and certain that the ships were only the Japanese invasion force. Nimitz signaled his commanders, "The carrier strike force will hit from the northwest, tomorrow." Fletcher ordered the Enterprise and Hornet to change course, and both task forces headed south to lie in wait. With the sighting of the Japanese invasion fleet confirmed, Midway's B-17s were finally given the order to attack. At 12:25 hours, 9 bombers lumbered down the island's runway to launch the first attack of the Battle of Midway. It would take over 4 hours for the B-17s to reach the enemy fleet and begin their high-level runs. Because of their extra fuel tanks, the fortresses were carrying only 36 500-pound bombs between them. None struck home. From altitude, the effects were hard to judge, and the crews reported hits on 6 vessels, including 2 battleships. In the aftermath, the U.S. Army Air Force would claim a major victory for land-based high-level bombers. Throughout the night of June the 3rd, the atmosphere on Midway was tense, but confident. The reports of B-17 crews were encouraging. Everyone believed that at least some damage had been done to the Japanese fleet. During the night, a Catalina torpedo attack on the invasion transports did succeed in hitting one Japanese oiler. Insignificant in real terms, but heartening for the waiting Marines. At first light, Midway's Catalinas were once more dispatched on their reconnaissance patrols. Because a Japanese raid on the airfield was almost certain, the B-17s were ordered to take off once more to prevent them from being caught on the ground. As the Japanese carrier strike force steamed at 24 knots on its final run into Midway, sailors and aircrew prepared themselves for the ordeal ahead, with traditional toasts and worship at the Shinto shrine on board every Japanese warship. All were keenly aware that they were about to strike the first major blow in a battle on which depended not only on their own lives, but the future of the Japanese Empire. At 0430 hours, Admiral Nagumo turned his carriers into the wind and launched his first strike wave, 108 aircraft in all. The rest, including his most experienced aircrew, were held in reserve in case any American warships were discovered. Nagumo believed the possibility extremely remote, so only after his first wave had been sent to Midway did he order the reconnaissance aircraft to begin their search on the surrounding ocean. The search, mounted by the Japanese carrier strike force, was conducted by only 7 aircraft from 5 ships. Akagi and Kaga each launched one VAL at 0430 hours. Both aircraft were to search 300 miles out and could cover an area 60 miles wide. At the same time, the battleship Haruna launched one float plane with a range of 150 miles. The cruisers, Tone and Chikuma, were each dispatched 2 float planes. But technical problems delayed Tone's aircraft for up to half an hour, and one of Chikuma's developed engine trouble and would have to turn back. The search was dangerously incomplete. As the Japanese scouted for American carriers, the Catalinas were in their turn looking for the Japanese. At 0530 hours, a single enemy carrier was sighted. On Midway Island and on the ships of the American task forces, the effect was electrifying. The Japanese were exactly where Admiral Nimitz had expected them to be. Shortly after the first sighting, one more vital piece of information was received from the Catalinas. A wave of strike aircraft was approaching the island. To Admiral Spruance on board the Enterprise, it was a priceless piece of information. Soon after the aircraft had hit Midway, the Japanese carriers would have to retrieve them for rearming and refueling. At that point, the carriers would be supremely vulnerable. As the Japanese strike wave came within range of Midway radar, all the island's remaining aircraft were scrambled. When the enemy arrived, the runways and hangars would be clear. Midway's fighters would be waiting to meet them, and the island's force of bombers and torpedo bombers would already be on their way to strike back at the Japanese carriers. In spite of the valiant efforts of Midway's mostly obsolete fighters, the Japanese bombers and dive bombers broke through without having lost a single aircraft. However, as soon as the lead attackers came within range of the island's anti-aircraft guns, they were met by a hail of fire. Finding no American planes on the ground, the bombers attacked and destroyed Midway's oil tanks on Sand Island. At the same time, the dive bombers targeted the airfield and hangars on Eastern Island and destroyed virtually every building in sight. With 15 of Midway's defending fighters already shot down, the Japanese fighters were now free to strafe ground targets. They too met a murderous hail of anti-aircraft fire. In all, 6 Japanese aircraft would fall to Midway's guns. When the Japanese headed back to their carriers at 0643, it was already apparent to the strike leader that although they left behind a trail of destruction, they had not succeeded in their primary objective. By radio, he reported that most of Midway's aircraft had escaped, and the island's runways remained largely intact. Midway's bombers were still a serious threat to the Japanese fleet. Even before the strike wave had returned to its carriers, Admiral Nagumo was ordering a second attack on the island. Only moments later, there was a dramatic confirmation of the threat Midway's aircraft posed to Nagumo's carriers. 6 American TBF torpedo bombers and 4 B-26 medium bombers suddenly bore down on the Japanese carrier fleet. The screening destroyers and cruisers put up a storm of anti-aircraft fire. At the same time, 10 Zero fighters of Akagi's Combat Air Patrol swooped in to attack. The TBFs did succeed in launching at Akagi, but violent maneuvering saved the Japanese carrier. Savaged by the Zeros and by furious anti-aircraft fire, only 1 TBF and 2 B-26s survived the raid. At almost the same time as the Japanese fleet was beating off the first wave of attackers from Midway, the American task forces were preparing to launch their own strike waves. Reconnaissance had now confirmed that there were not 1, but 2 enemy carriers in the area. Such a target was simply too good a chance to miss. The latest reconnaissance placed the 2 Japanese carriers over 200 miles from the Americans. The maximum range for an airstrike was around 150 miles, so the first priority was to close the gap. Assuming that Nagumo's carriers would still be steaming towards Midway, Fletcher set a course to intercept. Only Sperance's Task Force 16 with Enterprise and Hornet was to be sent. Task Force 17 with Yorktown would wait to recover her scout planes and follow later. If the Americans were to catch the Japanese as they rearmed aircraft returning from the attack on Midway, they would have to launch their first strike wave around 0700 hours. Although the range was closing quickly, it was still too great for the devastated torpedo bombers to strike and return home. They would be sent regardless. Those that survived the raid would have to ditch in the sea. Altogether, Hornet and Enterprise launched 29 Devastator torpedo bombers and 72 Dauntless dive bombers. Per fighter, they were covered by 20 Wildcats. Admiral Spruance was aware that only 2 of at least 4 Japanese carriers had been located, and kept 36 fighters to defend his task force from any Japanese counterattack. As the strike groups from the Hornet and Enterprise set course for the enemy fleet, Yorktown, her scout planes now recovered, raced to catch up with Task Force 16. At 0838, Admiral Fletcher launched his strike aircraft. Within half an hour, the total number of American aircraft heading for the Japanese fleet had reached 156. Even now, the Japanese were still unaware that they had been found and targeted by enemy carriers. Nagumo's men were toiling to prepare their aircraft for the second raid on Midway, and the Admiral was confident his fleet was secure. His scout planes had been out almost 2 hours and had reported no sign of an American task force. In fact, Japanese reconnaissance had been a disastrous failure. By now, Task Force 16, streaming towards Nagumo's fleet, was well inside the search area of the Japanese scout planes. However, Chikuma's float plane had flown right past the Americans and had failed to spot them, because Tone's scout could not search the same area until the return leg of its flight, and had been delayed by half an hour to begin with. The error was not detected for a considerable time. When it was 0725, the pilot's report mentioned only enemy surface ships. As a result, Nagumo now believed there was no immediate threat from the American carriers. At 0748, as the Japanese were just about to launch the second Midway strike, they themselves suddenly came under attack. It was another raid from Midway Island. First came 16 Dauntless dive bombers, whose inexperienced pilots approached in a shallow glide. The Zeros of Nagumo's Combat Air Patrol destroyed half their number before they even reached the carriers. Next came Midway's B-17s, dropping their bombs from 20,000 feet. Not a single Japanese vessel was hit. Midway's Marine Vindicators were equally unsuccessful. As the American raiders headed home and Nagumo once more turned into the wind to launch his second wave against Midway, dramatic news was reported by a scout plane. The pilot had spotted a carrier. For Nagumo, the revelation could not have come at a worse moment. While the Japanese second wave was preparing to launch, Nagumo's first wave just returned from Midway was cycling, waiting to land. also waiting to refuel and rearmed with the fleet's Zero fighters, which had been in action protecting the carriers. If Nagumo were to launch his second wave against the reported enemy carrier, they would have to go without fighter cover. Nagumo decided to wait. He would return his second wave below decks, recovering his circling aircraft for refueling, then launch a full-scale attack on the American fleet. At 0917, with all their aircraft recovered, the Japanese carriers, up to now heading towards Midway, turned east-northeast to close with the American force. Nagumo's strike force would be ready to launch at 10:30 hours. As the Japanese surged ahead at 30 knots, the decks of Nagumo's carriers were chaotic. Flight crews struggled frantically to refuel and rearm their aircraft. Bombs and torpedoes lay everywhere, and there was no time to follow safety procedures. And unknown to the Japanese, who had no radar, the first American torpedo bombers were only 3 minutes away. The American air group from Task Force 16 that followed a course based on the assumption that the Japanese fleet had carried on sailing towards Midway. Instead, Nagumo had changed course. As a result, most of the dive bombers and fighters from Hornet, 45 aircraft in all, failed to find the enemy. A second group of Hornet's aircraft had also at first missed Nagumo's fleet, but had then turned north and within minutes had found the Japanese carriers. The first target for Hornet's torpedo bombers was Akagi. As the squadron swept in at low level, the Zeros pounced. The few Americans that survived were torn apart by the fleet's anti-aircraft fire. Not one torpedo bomber and only one pilot survived. Within minutes of the first raid, torpedo bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown began their attack. Once again, the American pilots were slaughtered and no enemy ships were hit. Only 6 raiders survived. With the torpedo attacks beaten off and his fleet still fully unscathed, Nagumo was at last ready to send his waiting strike aircraft against the American carriers. Just as the launch signal was about to be given, American dive bombers, which had been lurking high in the clouds, pounced on the carriers. The first victim was Kaga. The time was around 10:20 hours. The first bomb to strike Kaga landed on the rear of her flight deck, squarely amongst aircraft, armed and waiting to take off. 2 more hit near her forward elevator. Another exploded in the hangar below, igniting fuel and detonating bombs. Kaga was left a raging inferno within minutes, and almost everyone on her bridge was killed. As Kaga burned, Akagi was launching its first Zero fighter for the attack that was supposed to smash the American fleet. At that moment, 3 dauntless dive bombers struck. The first hit on Akagi landed near her midships lift and exploded in the hangar. The next fell amongst the parked aircraft on her deck. Fuel and bombs ignited immediately, killing the elite of the Japanese air fleet in their cockpits. Within minutes, the fire had spread forward, and Admiral Nagumo's flagship was doomed. The next victim of the American dive bombers was Soryu. Just after 10:25, 3 bombs smashed into the carrier's flight deck. The first bomb fell between Soryu's second and third lifts. The next landed in front of the forward lift and penetrated to the hangar, detonating bombs, torpedoes, and fuel. The third struck on the rear deck, completely destroying a waiting strike wave. In the space of 5 minutes, the mightiest carrier fleet in existence had been shattered. Admiral Nagumo, his flagship blazing, was forced to transfer his flag to a cruiser. Of his once magnificent carrier force, only Hiryu was left, and immediately the order was given to launch her strike aircraft. There was still some hope, but even now, a devastating blow could be visited on the American enemy. The first wave of Hiryu's strike force was made up of 18 Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters. The target was Task Force 17 and the carrier Yorktown. Shortly before noon, the Vals were detected by Yorktown's radar. Already, 12 Wildcat fighters were in the air covering the carrier, and another 15 were on the deck refueling. These were ordered to launch at once. At the same time, Yorktown's aviation gas lines were shut down and her fire suppression system was activated. The Japanese strike wave, approaching at 10,000 feet, ran straight into Yorktown's fighter defenses. 10 were shot down by the Wildcats. The 14 survivors headed straight for the American carrier. 5 vessels survived the gauntlet of Wildcats and the hail of fire put up by Yorktown and her escorts. 3 bombs plunged into Fletcher's flagship. The first bomb struck Yorktown's flight deck and exploded. The second penetrated and burst below the funnel, damaging all but one of the ship's boilers and destroying her radar room. The third bomb crashed through Yorktown's #1 elevator and deep into her hangar. In spite of being hit by 3 bombs, so good was Yorktown's damage control that potentially catastrophic fires were quickly put out. No fuel or magazines exploded, and amazingly, Yorktown was streaming at 20 knots and able to recover and relaunch her fighters within 1 hour and 40 minutes of the attack. By now, the surviving Japanese carrier Hiryu had launched her second wave. A scratch force of 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zero fighters. Once again, American Wildcats savaged the raiders, but 9 torpedo bombers survived and swept into the attack. Because Yorktown was no longer belching smoke, she was mistaken for one of the unscathed sister ships. Although 5 more Kates were destroyed by anti-aircraft fire, 4 launched their torpedoes. Yorktown was hit twice on the port side, and one of the raiders deliberately crashed onto her deck. Within seconds of the strike, Yorktown was racked by explosions and began to list to port. At 1500 hours, the order was given to abandon ship. As the first of Yorktown's crew were being taken off by her attendant destroyers, aboard Enterprise, Admiral Spruance received news from a scout aircraft that Hiryu had been spotted. The Japanese carrier was 100 miles northwest of the dying Yorktown. At 1530 hours, Enterprise launched 24 Dauntless dive bombers and Hornet another 16. Meanwhile, Hiryu was recovering and refueling her last remaining aircraft for a third strike against the American carriers. At 1705, the Dauntless, undetected by Hiryu's combat air patrol, screamed down out of the sun. Hiryu maneuvered violently, but 4 bombs found their target. The first 2 bombs to hit blew Hiryu's #1 lift clean off, and left the whole forward deck a massive flame. The other 2 penetrated to the hangar, where bombs and fuel exploded violently. The waiting aircraft at the rear of the flight deck blew up, killing almost all their pilots. Admiral Nagumo's last carrier was finished, and with her, Japanese domination of the skies over the Pacific. When Admiral Yamamoto learned of the catastrophe that had befallen his fleet, he did not at once abandon all hope. Perhaps with the awesome firepower of his battleships and cruisers, he could yet destroy the Americans in a night battle. Yamamoto was clutching at straws. That evening, American carriers sailed eastward, and Yamamoto could no longer force a battle before daylight exposed his ships to air attack. At 02:55, on the morning of June the 5th, Admiral Yamamoto ordered a general withdrawal. On the morning of June the 6th, strike waves from the Enterprise and Hornet added to the American tally of 4 Japanese carriers by sinking 1 cruiser and damaging another. With them, the number of Japanese dead rose to 3,500 men. On the American side, the cost of victory was the carrier Yorktown, finally sunk by torpedoes from a prowling Japanese submarine, and the destroyer Hammond that had been lying alongside. In all, 307 aircrew, sailors, and Marines had died. For the United States, the Battle of Midway would prove the turning point in the fight against Japan. Unable to replace her losses in carriers and aircrew, the Japanese Empire would never again be capable of taking the initiative. Japan had not only suffered the greatest defeat in her history, but had, in a single day, lost the Pacific War.
Mr. Vice President, at the time, you were the youngest naval aviator in World War II. How did you come to join the Navy? How did you decide to enlist?
Well, I signed up on my 18th birthday as a seaman second class. I waited it, having graduated from a boarding school, till I was 18, was sworn in, determined to become a pilot. I'm a pilot. And right about that time, they changed the regulations so you could get to be a pilot without going through college or having had 2 years of college. And I guess the real reason is our country was engaged, had been bombed 6 months before. Pearl Harbor took place, December 7th, 1941. And so when June of 42 rolled around and I became 18, everybody in this country wanted to go out and fight for freedom and fight against the imperialists and fight against the Nazis. So it wasn't a hard decision. It was one that I took earlier than some others in my class, for example, but the country was together.
Why an aviator? Why flying?
Oh, I don't know. I think the excitement of it, I've been intrigued by airplanes. I'd never flown one, but there was a certain glamour and excitement to it. I had always had great respect for the Navy. Even as a little kid, I remember going aboard a destroyer in New York when it came in around 1939. But I just was intrigued by naval aviation. I had great respect for the outfit, for the excellence, and though very, very young, I just aspired to be a Navy pilot, carrier-based Navy pilot.
Where was your training?
Well, it started in Chapel Hill, and that was the pre-flight school stage. First time I ever flew was in Minneapolis at what they called a E-base, Naval Air Station there at what's now Wold Chamberlain, the great commercial airfield. And we started flying in those yellow Perils, those two-winged NTSs. And I flew there, coldest weather you can imagine. Never landed, I don't think, without some snow and ice on the ground until I got to Florida, where I went to advanced training, Texas, to Corpus Christi and some outlying air bases from Corpus. And I got my wings at Corpus, so that was the training scenario.
Was the San Jacinto your first ship assignment?
First and only ship. We put the ship into commission in either the end of 43 or early in 44, our air group to which I was assigned after I got my commission, went through torpedo bomber training, wanted to be a torpedo bomber. And then we did other training, and then our group, BT-51, was assigned to the San Jacinto when we put her in commission. I took her on a shakedown cruise down to Trinidad, did some anti-submarine work there, then on around through the Panama Canal and out into the Pacific in early 44.
Is there any way to describe your missions or the kind of day-to-day life of the pilot?
It's hard to describe the day-to-day missions. A lot of it was boredom. I was going over some letters that I'd sent home just the other day, and we did a lot of what they called ASP, anti-submarine patrol. We'd go out in front of the fleet, each pilot assigned a certain sector, each pilot, torpedo bomber pilot, having some fighter cover, and we'd go out and search visually for for submarines or for hostile military action of any kind on the part of the Japanese. And some of it was boring. The actual combat missions, most of which were what we call glide bombing. Push a plane over in about a 35-degree angle, I guess, and we had 400 or 500-pound bombs, and most of the combat missions of actual bomb dropping missions were on of that nature.
Was that the kind of mission you were on the day you were shot down?
I would say my target was a radio station on Chichijima, near the island of Ha-Ha-jima. I'm sure everybody's heard of that, and also Iwo Jima, which everyone has heard of. And my mission was to take out a radio station. We went up to about 10,000, 12,000 feet, came in that high, and then pushed over with wingmen and various groups following down and preceding us. And the air was full of this very, very black and ominous puffs that seemed almost surrealistic. I'd been shot at before, but never anything quite this intense. And I'll never forget it. You couldn't hear it, but you could almost feel puffs of black smoke around you, anti-aircraft coming up from the ground.
What about when you went down in the water? What was that sensation like?
That was a few minutes late. A few minutes later, and I was hit about halfway down a run, and the plane was on fire. Cockpit filled up with smoke. I had 2 men in the back of the plane, and I continued the bombing run just to release my bombs over the target. This was all split-second stuff. We were going not fast by today's standards, but red line by old standards, and released the bombs, pulled out to sea, and then I saw that my airplane was simply not flyable. The wings on a torpedo bomber fold, and the gas tanks are on either side of the wings, and there was fire right along where the fold of the wings were, which made me think that any minute the wing tanks would blow. I couldn't hardly see the instruments because the smoke filled the compartment so high, and I did some emergency procedures so the people in the back of the plane could get out. One of them did, and regrettably one of them did. The one who did was killed incidentally on the way down. And made the radio calls to our skipper, and then I bailed out myself. Hit my head on the tail of the airplane for pulling my own ripcord too early, and landed in the Pacific, fairly close to the Japanese-held island, and broke the record for the 100-yard swimming dash to find my life raft and paddle out to sea. Today, 40-some years later, it doesn't seem like it all happened, and yet in a sense, it's been a very, very internal and important part of my life. Saddest part, of course, being the loss of 2 crewmen that were depending on me for their lives.
When you were in the water, what was the hope that went through your mind, or did you look for ships or something?
Well, I knew that night Halsey's 5th Fleet was going to Mitscher's 5th Fleet was going to turn into Halsey's 3rd Fleet. We had been briefed on the fact that this was the last day our carrier was going to be in the northern Pacific waters, and that we were then to set sail for a general area of the Philippines. And so I knew that somebody better pick me up that day, or I would be picked up by the Japanese. And indeed, they did send a boat out, which was strafed. But I had hoped that I would be picked up because they had rescue submarines stationed as often as possible when we made raids like this. And I knew there was a submarine on patrol. In fact, we had a special code to call if we got in distress, which I did. And then I understand when I got back to my ship that the commanding officer of our squadron did the same thing, called the submarine. But the trouble is they never knew whether the submarine got the message. So I must say I was apprehensive. I didn't know what was going to happen for a couple of hours, and then out of the sea came a periscope and then a submarine, and thank God it turned out to be ours.
Had you ever been on a submarine before?
Well, been on the deck of one, but I'd never been on a patrol. We stayed on this thing it was a USS Finback, and I stayed on Finback for 30 days to get some air. We went topside and stood watch at night, some of the most majestic nights I've ever seen in my life. The stars so bright you could touch them, a flying fish, and a lot of time to think about what I'd been through and think about life, faith, and all that kind of thing. And we got depth charged. Our commanding officer of that submarine was awarded the Silver Star for the amount of Japanese tonnage sunk while I was right in that submarine. So it was more terrifying than flying. Submariners didn't think so, but we 3 pilots who were picked up did.
How long were you on a sub?
About 30 days. 30 days. And they didn't have any extra beds, so one guy would climb out of the bed and I'd climb in. A little dank in there, I might add, too. The air conditioning wasn't too good, and you could take a shower once a week. And even then, some guy would be standing there with a stopwatch saying you didn't use up more than 20 seconds worth of water.
Where did you go after that in terms of your naval career?
Well, the submarine took me back to, I think it was Midway. And then I got off and flew a Navy air transport plane, just hitched a ride down to Pearl Harbor. Had some rest time there, and then hitchhiked on back out to the fleet, which is thousands of miles away. And by that time, out in the Philippines, and the last airstrike I flew was over the Philippine Islands, over Manila. And then we were relieved and came back in time for Christmas '44, joined another squadron, had our orders to go out overseas again, BT-153, and the war ended. And meantime, I'd been married, so I was just thrilled about all that.
Then you were an instructor? And
No, I was just normal torpedo bomber pilot, training up new guys that hadn't been in combat and flying my missions and doing our gunnery and doing our bombing runs and all of that, same kind of airplane.
as you look back on a naval experience, is there any summing up you can do about its importance to your life? Or
I think it was probably the single most maturing experience I had. I went in there as an 18-year-old kid out of a rather sheltered environment and came out having nearly lost my life a couple of times. I had to land another time in torpedo bomber in the water with 400 or 500 pound deck charges in it. So that was the one that kept me on the ball. And I saw lives lost right on our flight deck. Saw a chief petty officer and cut in half when I was just landed my plane, standing there. This guy was just cut apart. The flight deck was stunned, and this fantastic chief petty officer yelled at the men to grab a hose, clean this mess up. Come on, let's get this ship going. And it's life, and yet it was life going on. And this made an impression on me as an 18-year-old kid, 20-year-old kid saying this kind of thing. But it really formed my impressions about the need for a strong military, the need for the country to be together when things are rough out there. I think combat is something I hope none of my 5 kids and none of my 9 grandchildren will ever be involved in. But it gave my life a dimension that I wouldn't have gotten otherwise, and it gave me a great respect for the armed services of the United States. It gave me a great respect for those who risk their lives now, even though maybe not in a combat situation. But I think of the recent raids on Libya, superb performance by the Air Force, the Navy. And I just think, I guess to sum it up, it's heightened my convictions about the rightness and the greatness of the United States, and my convictions about the need to keep this country strong.
thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Excuse me. Could you ask him just to talk a little bit about the aircraft itself?
Okay. I'd like to ask you a couple questions about the Avenger.
Yeah.
What was it like flying that?
Well, I liked it because it was stable. It was then the biggest single-engine plane, I believe, in either the Air Force or the Navy. The Army Air Corps, or the Navy, it's then called. It was very stable, had a large wing, it was a 3-place plane. I was a pilot, had a guy in the turret, then a guy below, tail gunner with a 50 caliber or 30 caliber pop gun back there, and the turret had, I forget what, we had some 20 caliber guns firing forward, the triggered from the stick. But the beautiful thing about the airplane was its stability for landing on a tossing deck. The CVL, fast carrier, but was a cruiser hull, very narrow, and I think she tossed more than the big CVs. So the thing that was reassuring, you could slow that airplane down and not worry as much about spinning in like you would from a Corsair or an F-6F or something of that nature. And it was stable, it was dependable. You could take a hit and the plane could still fly. I remember landing it in the water, my plane having been disabled from engine troubles. Ship couldn't take me on board, so I had to land in the water. I had 2 men on the plane, 400 or 500 pound depth charges, and a little bit of sea, not much, but I never got wet. Put the tail down, landed tail first, hull came in, climbed out on the wing, crewman climbed out through the turret, pulled out the life raft, and they didn't get wet. And the plane stayed there, floated for a while, and then gradually sank to the depths of the Pacific, but stability, dependability. Thing could fly when a lot of airplanes were down.
Because there was no ejection seat, so when you went out, you just had to climb over the edge.
If you went out, you hopefully did it better than I did. You're supposed to dive out onto the wing, and the TBF had a bar across the top of it, so hoisted yourself out by this bar, and then dove out. I was supposed to put the plane in a right-hand turn, so men could get out of the door in the back, which I did, made a 360. Then I put it in a turn so I could get out, and but I pulled the ripcord too early, and my head struck the tail of the plane, so much so that I thought I'd really been wounded. Got down. In fact, one of the pilots, Doug West, who was flying a fighter, flying a torpedo bomber, saw me and dropped some medical supplies because he thought I'd been really hurt. It was really like a strawberry in baseball on your side when you slide. It just took the whole side of my skin off, but no damage at all. And I'm not too proud of that part of my exit from the airplane. It wasn't too easy a plane to get out. You couldn't dump it upside down because you had a bar on top of your head.
Aviation, the art of aeronautics, began with the dreamers, inventors, and daredevils who dared to defy gravity. The journey of aviation was nurtured by pioneers like the Wright brothers, whose first flight marked a historic milestone. The role of aircrafts in world wars was groundbreaking, dramatically changing warfare strategies. This initiated a technological evolution in aviation, transforming the simplistic wings of a biplane into the thunderous roar of jet engines. Let's journey through the ages of aviation. Behind every great aircraft, there were great minds. These visionaries, like Sir Frank Whittle, the innovator of the turbojet engine, redefined air travel. Then there's Skunkworks' Kelly Johnson, the genius behind the SR-71 Blackbird. His designs combined speed, stealth, and power, crafting machines that dominated the heavens. The contributions of these pioneers have left an indelible mark on the canvas of aviation, shaping the course of history and inspiring generations of engineers and aviators. Each epoch in aviation history gave birth to extraordinary aircrafts, each with their own unique features and roles. The Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird was a marvel of speed and stealth. The F-105 Thunderchief, a supersonic fighter bomber, was vital in the Vietnam War. The P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter, was critical in World War II. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a heavyweight fighter, was used extensively in the same war. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, is a close air support icon. The Messerschmitt Me-262 marked a leap forward in aviation technology. Each of these game changers were instrumental in their eras, and their legacies still resonate today. Beyond the game changers, there are those that have transcended their practical roles to become icons. The Concorde was not just an aircraft, it was a supersonic symbol of luxury and speed. The B-52 Stratofortress, a strategic bomber, is an icon of power and resilience. These magnificent machines and others like them have become much more than just aircrafts. They are enduring icons that encapsulate the audacious spirit, the relentless innovation, and the boundless ambition that define the world of aviation. For more amazing aerial footage, and to join us in this incredible journey, check out the Dronescapes YouTube channel.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.